Were vanilla dungeons so long? Well, because the designers thought people would only do them once. In order to explain why pretty much all of the vanilla dungeons were so long, I kind of have to explain the philosophy behind MMO dungeons at the time. Before WoW, EverQuest was the most popular MMORPG on the market, and they didn't have instance dungeons or raids. What this meant was that every single dungeon or raid boss in the game was essentially an open world dungeon or world boss. So guilds had to fight each other for the opportunity to clear dungeons, and had to fight off constant attempts to kill raid bosses. And since EverQuest had player collusion, they would sometimes hire other guilds that just had big character models to stand at the entrances of dungeons to literally body block people from getting in, just so they could complete it. And because of this dungeon design philosophy, only the most hardcore players got to do dungeons, and it wasn't something everyone was able to experience. And World of Warcraft could have easily gone down this same path, as a lot of the development team were hardcore EverQuest players, and there was a huge argument about whether or not WoW dungeons should be instanced or not. Now, we all know which side won that debate in the end, as all dungeons and raids take place in separate instances, so that anyone can do them if they want, as long as they have a group. But it very easily could have gone the other way. And since there was not too many standards when it came to MMOs yet, the standard for dungeon design was to just make them really big, kinda like D&D dungeons, which also partly contributed to their large designs, as in D&D, players basically only complete a dungeon once, and if they ever return to it, it's usually pretty much empty. And under a one-time dungeon visit rule, it makes sense for them to be big or massive and have lots of things to explore and navigate with tons of bosses along the way. And I think it was under these two design philosophies, where developers didn't think people would do a dungeon more than once, and that there wasn't really a precedent for repeatable dungeons in mainstream games yet, that led to developers kind of going crazy with their sizes. Once they created the Deadmines, they basically used that as a benchmark for how big other dungeons needed to be, and for how raids and high-level dungeons needed to be bigger. On screen, I'll show you a little diagram of the Wailing Caverns development from the WoW Diary, and you can see the original dungeon looked pretty similar to a modern-day dungeon, before they then doubled the length of it, added side wings to it, and then added a maze section to double the size of it again. Although even at the time, they thought the maze section was a little too much, so they added little mushrooms in the cave to help navigate the maze better. Although they made a mistake, and the mushrooms blended into the environment too well, so that didn't really help with navigations very much, as people just thought it was normal ground clutter. And taking a quote from the WoW Diary, "In hindsight, it seems obvious that our early dungeons were too big, but previous MMO dungeons were epic experiences embraced by only the most hardcore players. The paradigm of big dungeons was established by EverQuest's non-instance play spaces, where play spaces needed to accommodate everyone on the server who wanted to go there. Besides, we didn't want people to play through content too fast, otherwise they'd be done with WoW in only a couple of months. What we didn't realize was how much private play spaces, instances, would shrink the amount of overall play space needed. Besides, the concept of short, one-hour dungeons didn't exist in MMOs. The closest things to one-hour dungeons were the wings of Aaron Keller's Scarlet Monastery. We learned only after shipping WoW that players really liked short dungeon runs, and so the Scarlet Monastery's wing approach was the direction taken by subsequent expansions. So basically, they created massive mega dungeons because they expected players to explore it maybe once, but they had also created a system of gearing that required players to run dungeons multiple times. And you can kind of see the disconnect between the different parts of the development team. The people who added gear to raids were not really the same people who designed the dungeons. And you also had different people who designed the fights for those dungeons. So while they were created with the intention of running through them multiple times, they were also kind of created to only be ran once, as they didn't think players would enjoy doing the same dungeon more than one time. So with future expansions, they significantly reduced the size of dungeons, and in the Burning Crusade, there was just a whole bunch of short dungeons, and occasionally they might have a dungeon that's a little bit longer than normal, but all of the biggest dungeons in the game are all still pretty much every single dungeon from vanilla WoW. And whenever they remade one of the old dungeons, they would usually cut them in parts or completely remove parts of the dungeon, like they did with Skullimots or the Sunken Temple. They've neutered pretty much all of the original classic dungeons to the point where none of them are as long as they used to be. And you have to play classic WoW if you want to do dungeons in their original mega forms. And it turns out players like the smaller dungeons. People like to get through a dungeon quickly, and big, long dungeons are just kind of tedious once you've done them for a second or third time. So that's why vanilla dungeons were long and why dungeons after Vanilla WoW were created much smaller. In Vanilla WoW, there was a pair of gloves that were a low-level epic world drop, so they could be sold and bought off the auction house, that were best in slot for melee classes that could equip them. So warriors would go out of their way to grab these items, as well as the odd shaman and melee hunter. Now, what made these gloves so good was that they gave +7 in weapon skill to 3 different weapons, which is probably going to need some explaining to let you know why that's a good thing, because even today, people aren't 100% sure what weapon skills did in Vanilla WoW. Basically, an increase in weapon skill would increase the damage you did when you landed a glancing blow. Melee classes on their normal auto attacks have about a 40% chance to do a glancing blow on bosses or other mobs that are 3 levels higher than you. And when you perform a glancing blow, you would only do about 70% the normal damage, and be incapable of critting with that attack. So, wasn't as bad as straight up missing, but was still something you didn't want to happen. And having an increased weapon skill past the maximum amount would lower the damage penalty of glancing blows by about 3% per point. So with 1 extra weapon skill point above the maximum of 300, you'd do about 73% damage instead of 70%. Kind of. Here's where the weapon skill stat gets a little tricky. People aren't exactly sure how much weapon skill impacted glancing blows, but most people agreed it was about 3% per point, and having 10 points would reduce the damage penalty to about 5 to 10%, allowing you to do 90 to 95% damage on glancing blows, which almost eliminates glancing blows from the equation, and would vastly increase your DPS, as 40% of your auto attacks would be glancing blows. It was to the point where 1 extra point in weapon skill was more valuable than 1% more of any other stat, like a 1% increase in crit, for example. So 1 piece of equipment giving you a +7 is really good, as that's almost at the 10-point soft cap by itself. And there were very few items that gave weapon skills, let alone the maximum amount possible for 3 separate weapons. In the game files, there's a series of items called of proficiency, which are random items that give weapon skills as one of their stats. Kind of like how items of strength would give an increase in strength, or items of the bear would give an increase in strength and stamina, and so on. It was supposed to be the name of a series of random items that just had weapon skills on them, except for the fact that they were never actually added to the game. They just existed in the game files and could even be linked to through macros, as they were fully programmed and set up. And these weapon skill bonuses on of proficiency items would go from +1 all the way up to +7, meaning +7 was the maximum amount you could get on a piece of equipment. And because of these of proficiency items, we know that the Edge Master's handguards have the maximum amount for those 3 weapon types. Now, the Edge Master handguards are an epic world drop, meaning it's almost impossible to farm out a pair for yourself, and you're just going to have to fork over a ton of gold on the auction house in order to buy some, if they're even available. So while these gloves might be really good and best in slot for some classes until way later raid tiers, don't expect to see too many people having these gloves on the classic servers. Expect to only see these gloves on people who are either really lucky, really rich, or really hardcore. In World of Warcraft, there are 2 qualities of gear that aren't supposed to have stats on them, and those are the poor and common quality, or the gray and white items. Gear doesn't start getting stats on them until green quality, or uncommon. But throughout the course of WoW's history, there have been some pieces of common quality gear that did have extra stats on them, similar to green quality and above. Although I'm not sure that's the case anymore. One of the more famous pieces of white quality equipment with stats was the Battered Viking Shield, which dropped off of Olaf and Uldaman. The shield gave an additional 8 stamina and 4 spirit, despite the fact that most white items did not give any extra stats like this. Usually they only give armor and nothing else, so the Battered Viking Shield was quite the oddity, and was most likely the only white item in the game with stats on it, until patch 2.3, when they upgraded the quality of the shield from common to rare, completely skipping uncommon quality. And this upgrade made sense since it did drop off of a mob in a dungeon, and generally special drops from dungeons are rare quality. And there wasn't really a reason for this item to have stats while being uncommon. but vanilla WoW gear had all kinds of crazy stats on them, and some pieces of equipment even had negative stats. So it wasn't too weird and kind of fit into how everything was weird. And if anything, I assume there was just a mistake with the shield. It was meant to be a higher quality, or it wasn't meant to have stats on it. Or it was meant to be a quest item, as quest items are most of the time common quality. And a lot of quests in vanilla WoW required you to equip a weapon or something in order to accept a quest. Although even then, those special quest items didn't have stats on them. So this shield didn't really make sense, but also wasn't the last time they had white gear with stats on them. In Wrath of the Lich King, they introduced a vendor called Warsmith Sigfina, who sold 5 pieces of equipment, 4 weapons and 1 shield. All of this equipment was common quality, yet all of the weapons had an extra stat on them. The weapons all had a damage proc effect, where every time they hit with the weapon, it also did extra frost damage. And unlike normal weapon proc effects, this one happened every time you hit instead of a chance on hit. So I assume that's why they made these white item weapons, because it just added extra damage with every attack, and they thought to balance it out by lowering the quality of the weapons. That's just one theory, however. These weapons were also incredibly useful because you could sell them on the auction house since none of them were bind on pickup. And what made these weapons so useful was farming Fastidious in AQ40, a boss which required both frost and physical damage in order to kill. So if you were playing a class like a Warlock who had 0 frost or physical damage, you could equip one of these weapons in order to gain both of those. And you could also go to the auction house to buy one of these weapons, and they were the best in slot weapons for Iron Man challenges, where part of the rules is you can't equip any green items or above. And since these are all technically white quality items, they were legal for the challenge even though they had special effects. But then in Legion, Blizzard upped the quality of all of the weapons in the shield to green quality, which also changed them to bind on pickup, so they can no longer be sold on the auction house. Most of them kept the exact same effects they had, where they still did frost damage on each attack, except one of the weapons got the frost proc removed and instead was given normal stats for some reason. And I'm not really sure why these items had their quality increased, as it didn't really seem necessary, but it was most likely another fix like they did with the battered Viking shield. But this wasn't the end for white quality items with stats. When Blizzard did their first stat squish and changed all of the stats on gear to compensate, there were a lot of reports of white quality items from quests incorrectly having stats on them. So what probably happened was whatever formula they used to downgrade the stats on all the gear in the world probably applied stats to certain item levels of gear, and accidentally gave stats to some quest reward items that were common quality, where normally they'd have no stats at all. Eventually though, all of these items were fixed, and none of them no longer have stats on them. And as far as I know, that's the end of the story for common quality items having stats on them. I don't think there are any other white quality items in the game with stats on them anymore, as all of them were either fixed to no longer have stats, or they were upgraded in quality like the shield and weapons. Which keeps things consistent, I guess, but as someone who really enjoys the Iron Man challenge, I wasn't the biggest fan of the weapon changes. In vanilla WoW, there were a few items which had negative stats on them. Most of the time, the negative stats was just stamina, but a few of them gave negatives in other things as well. In this video, we'll talk about negative stats on items, why they existed in vanilla, and why they didn't continue this trend going forward. Now, the biggest reason why vanilla WoW had negative stats on items is because that was a classic RPG trope. It was very common for RPG games and fantasy stories to have corrupted or cursed items, which gave you powerful bonuses at some kind of drawback, with the most iconic one probably being the Ring of Power from The Lord of the Rings. In The Lord of the Rings, the One Ring gave you the ability to go invisible, but at the cost of slowly driving you mad, and a whole bunch of other negative side effects and benefits as well. So, negative stats on items, in which there is already negative effects on some powerful abilities, just made sense. Like for example, the vanilla item Skull of Impending Doom. It was an offhand weapon that increased your run speed by 60% for 10 seconds, but at the cost of draining your health and mana while active. An item with a powerful effect that had a downside to it. So items with negative stats just seem like the natural conclusion to this fantasy trope. Like for example, the Shriveled Heart. It's a neck item which gives 13 stamina, but at the cost of -5 spirit and strength. If you're playing a class which doesn't need those 2 stats, that could be a decent stamina boost. Although that's not really a good example, You might be more familiar with the most famous item that had negative stats, known as the Corrupted Ashbringer. This item completely fits the trope of powerful items at a cost. The Ashbringer was one of the strongest weapons in the game, had a good on-use effect, and some extra effects out in the open world. Scarlet Crusade members would see you as friendly, all at the cost of negative 25 stamina on the weapon. And since this weapon was removed with the Wrath of the Lich King, it's one of the rarest weapons in the game. Other MMOs at the time also had gear with negative stats on them, including EverQuest, so no one really batted an eye at them at the time. But there might have been another reason why gear with negative stats existed. In the WoW Diary book, one of the Vanilla WoW developers talks about how they had a philosophy of adding intentionally bad items to the game in order to make good items look much better in comparison. A very common practice done in card games to give the very strong cards better value when compared to all the intentionally bad cards. But it's not really something that happens very often in RPG video games. The book also talks about how they didn't really embrace this philosophy fully and just kind of dropped it eventually. So that could be a factor in why gear with negative stats existed, but it's much more likely the gear was just a homage to the corrupted or cursed item trope, which is very prevalent in RPG fantasy games, books, and movies. And if you take a look at items which have negative stats on them, this is a very easy conclusion to come to. So let's go over basically all of the negative stat items. For one, you have the Corrupted Ashbringer, which is pretty obvious. Even the Shriveled Heart could be seen as a cursed item, as you're gaining stats from someone else's body parts, which is taboo. The Ring of Scorn gave negative 3 spirit, and was a reward item from getting revenge on the guy who killed a Forsaken's wife. The Doomsayer's Robes had negative 10 stamina, and was a reward from the first part of the quest chain, which ultimately rewarded the Skull of Impending Doom, an item I talked about earlier, which drained your health and mana in order to run faster, which thematically fits, as of course the Doomsayer Robes would give you negative stats, as the whole quest chain was about getting a cursed item. The Cursed Eye of Paleth was an offhand item which gave negative 3 stamina, and has cursed in its name, and is a reward from a quest chain that has to do with finding a cursed item. Corruption, a sword which gave negative 40 spirit, with corruption in its name. Cloak of Rot, which gave negative 5 stamina, and has rot in its name. The Black Widow Band was a ring item that gave negative stats for stamina, which is just a drop from a spider, and thematically, could easily be reasoned that you're gaining the plus 7 intellect at the cost of some of your health from like a spider bite or something. The Cowl of Necromancy is kind of in the similar vein, in that it has negative 4 stamina, but gives you 15 intellect on a level 31 item, and is related to necromancy, which is usually a dark art in most RPG games, including World of Warcraft. So as you can see, nearly all of the negative stat items are related to cursed, dark magic, or taboo items. So thematically, it makes sense why they all had negative stats. Of course, there were also a few negative stat items that didn't really fit this trope, like the Fletcher's Gloves, which were just a leatherworking crafted item that had negative 1% parry chance, but gave you an increased 1% crit chance with missile weapons, which was later changed to negative stamina stat instead of a negative parry chance. Although these gloves do kind of make sense thematically as well, giving up some of your defenses in order to have better attack power. But after Vanilla WoW, there were no more negative stat items added to the game, and then all of the negative stat items were removed in Cataclysm with the Old World revamp. So why didn't Blizzard continue the trend of cursed or corrupted items with negative stats? The answer to that is basically just how they did stats in Vanilla WoW in general. Stats in Vanilla WoW were completely different to how they were in, say, the Burning Crusade. Items didn't have haste rating, crit rating, dodge rating. Items would just straight up give you a 1% chance to crit, a 1% chance to dodge, a 1% chance to hit, etc. It was in the Burning Crusade that they added the rating stat, which would add up to then give you maybe 1% chance to dodge or crit, once you got to an appropriate amount of that stat. Also, stamina used to be budgeted into an item's stats, along with all of the attack power increasing abilities. Today, stamina is just on pieces of gear alongside armor in your main stat boosts as your primary stats. And then a piece of gear will budget out your secondary stats, unrelated to the primaries. But in Vanilla WoW, there were no primary stats, and all of the stats were budgeted together, except for armor. So if something had stamina on it, that means it had less damaging stats, or healing stats, than a similar level piece of gear that didn't have stamina on it, as it was taking away some of that gear's budgeted stats for that stamina.
So, some DPS classes could bring a set of glass cannon gear with no stamina on it that did a lot more damage. But with how raids and dungeons worked back then, that wasn't a good idea, as it meant you would die more often as well. And then there was a whole bunch of other secondary stats that don't even exist today. And that's how you have an environment in which negative stats were acceptable. Once stats started to be more streamlined and less random, where pieces of gear had main stats and then budgeted secondary stats, negative stats don't really fit into that format of gear. So if they wanted to add an item that had some kind of negative effect, it would just be added to a special weapon or item, like the trinket Whispers in the Dark, which was a haste trinket that gave you a really good haste proc for 12 seconds, but at the downside of after that proc ended, it would then decrease your haste for 8 seconds. And this trinket was released not too long ago in Legion, as it was a drop from Gul'dan in the Nighthold. So Blizzard is still willing to put out items that have negative effects. They've just kind of moved away from putting negative stats directly on pieces of equipment. And that's why negative stats was only a vanilla thing, and will most likely stay a vanilla thing.
Now, if you play a Ret Paladin in Vanilla WoW, and if you're not fighting an undead, you only have one damaging ability, until the target goes below 20% health anyway, in which case you'll gain access to a second damaging ability. The way Ret Pallies do most of their damage is through their seal system, which buffs their auto attacks and does different things depending if you consume it with your judgment ability, which is their only damaging move, which requires you to have a seal active in order for it to work. So basically, a Ret Paladin's DPS revolves around activating a seal, using judgment to consume that seal to do its unique effect, and then reapplying another seal to buff your auto attack damage while you wait for judgment to come off cooldown. And that's basically how Ret Paladins played. They just waited around for judgment to come off cooldown, as they couldn't really do anything else damage-wise, unless they also wanted to use their AoE ability on single target, or if they were fighting undead, in which case they gain access to two new abilities called Exorcism and Holy Wrath. Now, this may surprise you to hear, but this version of the Ret Paladin wasn't added to the game until 2 weeks before the game went live. So basically, completely untested and added in at the last second. Because during the beta, Ret Paladins had a little bit more to do than just activate a seal and use judgment. Ret Paladins had two more damaging abilities called Crusader Strike and Holy Strike. Holy Strike was basically the Paladin version of the warrior ability Heroic Strike, where it would turn your next weapon swing into a harder hitting attack. But Holy Strike turned all that damage into pure holy damage, which meant it bypassed armor and was actually really good. And Crusader Strike is an ability Paladins have in the live version of the game, and they basically have had the ability ever since it was given back to them at the beginning of the Burning Crusade. And what Crusader Strike did in WoW's beta was it would do instant damage and then put a debuff on the target, which would increase the holy damage they took for the next 30 seconds. And this debuff would stack up to 5 times. And Crusader Strike did not have a cooldown. So Paladins actually had a spammable damaging move, as well as a decent holy damage ability on a 10-second cooldown with Holy Strike, which would hit harder the more stacks of Crusader Strike you had up on the target. And this version of the Paladin in the beta was actually pretty good, and did decent damage, unlike how a baseline Ret Paladin played in Classic WoW, where they were one of the lowest DPS classes in the game. So, why did Blizzard remove Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, and then basically give them nothing to replace their only damaging abilities? Well, there are some theories and rumors about this, and I plan on going over both of them. First up, mechanically speaking, these two abilities were removed from the game because they just made the Paladin go incredibly quickly. Both Crusader Strike and Holy Strike cost mana to use, and caster classes in Vanilla WoW had to worry about their mana. So they had to be careful about which abilities they could spam before running out of mana. And while Paladins did good damage with these two abilities, having a spammable Crusader Strike caused them to run out of mana a little bit too quickly, and the Vanilla WoW class design was absolutely not about making the mana cost lower, as there were a couple of other classes in the game who were unviable because they also had so much mana problems. So many people theorize the reason they converted Ret Paladins into the auto attack version they got for Vanilla WoW was a band-aid way of solving the mana issue that Crusader Strike brought up.
If the Paladin only needs to use one ability every 8 seconds in order to do damage, then they don't have to worry about mana as much for their DPS. Regardless of the fact, this promoted a style of gameplay which wasn't as fun as what Crusader Strike and Holy Strike might have brought about. And there was also the debuff limit. Vanilla WoW only had an 8 debuff slot limit, which was later increased to 16, which is what we have at the start of Classic WoW. And if the Paladin's main damaging ability, Crusader Strike, required them to take up one of these debuff slots, then Paladins wouldn't be able to use their main damaging ability in raids anyway, and they'd be stuck with only Holy Strike every 10 seconds. Because in beta, when Paladins had both Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, Judgment and Seals didn't really exist in the way they did in Vanilla WoW. Beta Judgment was literally just Holy Wrath, where it was an AoE that only worked on undeads. And when they changed the Paladin class to how it eventually worked in Vanilla WoW, they changed Judgment into the 8-second cooldown ability, which consumed Seals in order to do damage. And then they just added in Holy Wrath, which had Judgment's old effect. And the seal system was completely added to the game along with this Judgment change, where the seal system in Vanilla WoW requires you to activate a short-term buff on yourself, which is usually about 30 seconds, and then you consume that 30-second buff with your Judgment in order to do damage and other various effects. And while that 30-second buff is on you, it gives you an auto attack buff, which does various things depending on which seal you're using. And the things in beta WoW, which were called seals, were just changed into the blessings, which is kind of confusing to explain in this video, but to make it as simple as possible, they completely created the seal mechanic from scratch at the start of Vanilla WoW, and then for some reason gave it a naming convention after another set of abilities that Paladins already had, that functions nothing like how the seal mechanic works. Anyways, since they didn't have the seal and Judgment mechanic alongside Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, they never really got to test how that would function for the class, allowing them to have 3 damaging abilities that they would then use regularly along with the auto attack buff from seals. Considering that system would still have the mana problems and the debuff slot limit problem, I can see why they decided to simplify things for themselves and just give them the auto attack thing instead, so that Paladins could focus on being buff bots. You see, Paladin buffs were really good, but they only lasted for 5 minutes, and you can only place one on a person at a time. So having a Paladin in your raid meant everyone else in your raid could do more damage and healing, but that also meant the Paladin spent most of their global cooldowns just buffing everyone else, making them one of the only pure support classes to exist in the game, which could be another big reason why they were changed to focus on auto attacks instead of having an active rotation with Crusader Strike, because they wanted the Paladin to use those global cooldowns on buffing the raid instead of using them on damaging moves. Of course, the seal mechanic wasn't a huge success either, as it was all but removed after Vanilla WoW since, while it did have a few fans, it wasn't very good, and I'm sure everyone probably would have liked it more if it just did a little bit more damage or, was a little bit more involved than having to press 2 buttons every 8 seconds. So if you go back and watch any beta footage of World of Warcraft that has Paladins in it, you can actually see Crusader Strike on the debuff bar of the video I'm shooting right now, as a shaman is going out and fighting a Paladin in the open world, and you can see the Crusader Strike debuff on him as he's killing the higher level Paladin. But Vanilla WoW was already taking a long time to come out. It was in development for 5 years before they launched, so they started just rushing things towards the end, but it's kind of a wonder why they decided to make such a drastic change to the Paladin class 2 weeks before the game launched, which kind of segues into this next section of the video. Now, outside of the mechanical reasons that people theorize, these aren't, confirmed in any way, about why they removed Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, there's also the rumors of 2 game developers joining around the same time the seal system was added. 2 famous EverQuest players named Furor and Tiggle joined the WoW development team at around the time Paladins got this drastic change to their damaging rotation. And the change to the Paladin class was so last second that even in the official Vanilla WoW guide, which was sold in stores, they featured the Paladin old class systems, including Crusader Strike, Holy Strike, and calling their blessings seals. And you see, these 2 players
were infamous for absolutely hating hybrid classes, to the point where they would stage protests in-game whenever they found out a hybrid class was doing anything except being a bug bot, or something like that. They just really didn't like the fact that a hybrid class could do as much damage as a pure DPS class, and they were well known for wanting hybrid classes to basically be terrible as a tax for being able to do a whole bunch of different things, which would make sense why paladins lost their fun rotation as soon as they joined and were given the infamous seal system for vanilla WoW. Although I'd call these just rumors instead of what actually happened, because there isn't confirmation this is why it happened. And in fact, Ghostcrawler is largely credited with changing paladins to how they were in vanilla WoW. And Ghostcrawler is also the person who wanted hybrid classes to perform just as well as pure DPS classes. So what probably happened was Ghostcrawler just wanted to try out this change with the paladins and see how it worked. Saw that it failed in vanilla WoW, and then changed his philosophy going forward to try to push all classes to basically being equal. So, all that being said, there's not too much credit to the Furor or Tiggle changing vanilla WoW paladins into a garbage spec, although this wouldn't be a video about beta ret paladins without mentioning this very famous rumor. I just couldn't find any confirmation for any of these rumors besides lots of speculations on forums and stuff, which is usually the case for very famous WoW rumors. So, there you have it. The reason paladins only had one damaging ability was because it was given to them at the last second without any kind of testing like all the other classes got, as well as a whole bunch of rumors and theories as to why they made this decision in the first place. After vanilla WoW, Blizzard changed paladins to no longer be buff bots. They allowed them to actually tank and gave them competitive DPS. Arguably, it was much better than it was in vanilla WoW though. Did you know that there were plans to have a huge server-wide questline for Warlocks similar to the AQ event? The event would have involved Warlock players needing to perform a global collection effort to rebuild Medivh spellbook, and after they completed that, they would perform a group ritual to open the Dark Portal, while players on the server protected them from enemy attacks. Now, the source for all this was from an interview from a vanilla WoW developer, and the main reason why they cut this was because of the AQ opening the gates event. Because you see, they did something similar to this with the opening of Entourage, where players could go on a massive quest line, literally the biggest quest line in the game's history, which also required the server to contribute a whole bunch of supplies, which would culminate into ringing the gong that opened the gates to the raid instance. And during the opening of the gates, there would be a server-wide event for 10 hours, where elite monsters would pour through the portal and overrun the zone of Silithus. And there would be bosses that dropped loot, so there was many players scrambling to kill as many of them as possible in the time allotted to them. And there was also crystals that spawned around the world, which would spawn mobs and bosses that also dropped loot. So everyone in the world participated in this event. And it was worth participating as you could get gear from it. Now, this all sounds great, but the reason why they never did something like this ever again was because this completely crashed servers while the event was going on. Because you see, this event was a limited time thing, and could only happen one time per server. So you had 10 hours to do this one event, otherwise you'd never be able to do it again. And under those kinds of time constraints, pretty much everyone tried to participate if they could, and the servers weren't really built to have that many people in one zone at a time, or just that many people online at the same time killing a whole bunch of monsters. So most servers were basically just unplayable during the opening of the gates, which kind of killed the whole point of the event being a limited time anyway, as if you couldn't log in to do the event, or if you got disconnected every time you tried to get closer to Silithus, then the event was basically wasted on you anyway. And since the opening of the gates was such a disaster from a developer point of view, players still love the event and think fondly back to it to this day, but Blizzard doesn't like it when people aren't able to play the game due to hardware limitations. So they weren't happy with the event, and they never tried anything like it again. And even canceled the planned Warlock event, which most likely would have been the event for the launch of the Burning Crusade, but they just didn't have the hardware to do something like that again, so they just scrapped it. In some of the early beta builds of WoW, there were Dark Portal placeholders in random parts of the world, including one located underwater off the coast of Megara. For many years, the WoW community theorized that Blizzard was just using the Dark Portal as a placeholder for dungeons, raids, or battleground entrances. Basically, since the Dark Portal is placed in so many different parts of the world at random, which ended up being near those kinds of entrances anyway, it was a pretty safe assumption to make. And the only placeholder that didn't really make sense was the one located underwater. But they did have a planned battleground in that zone, and it was heavily Naga based, so a lot of people just thought it was a placeholder for the entrance to that battleground. But then with the WoW Diary book, we found out that those were not placeholders for dungeon entrances at all, and were actually potential locations for the Dark Portal to be placed. Now, I mentioned this in a previous video briefly, and a lot of people were very apprehensive about that explanation and insisted that they were actually just placeholders because the Dark Portal has a very set location in lore already that predates Vanilla WoW. But here's the thing with how they created Vanilla WoW. They were very flexible with the lore and the zone layouts. They were absolutely willing to move the Dark Portal somewhere else if they thought it was cooler. And a lot of the lore of zones was done by other people besides Chris Metzen, who basically wrote most of WoW's lore, and was being designed alongside Warcraft 3 in the early stages. So their lore could be changed at a moment's notice. Taking a quote from the WoW Diary, Chris Metzen and the art team only vaguely knew the level ranges, which were finalized only in the last year of development. In this fluid state of indecision, even major lore objects like the Dark Portal bounced around. Chris decided to move it out of the Tree of Life area. No one on the team called it Tedrasil, letting the World Tree become its own area. He planned to move the Dark Portal to Ajara because the game designers were thinking of making it a high-level area anyway, and it was also cool to have the Dark Portal submerged in water. Eventually, Chris decided on putting it in the Blasted Lands because there wasn't really anything else interesting going on there. So, based on this quote, the Dark Portal could have absolutely ended up underwater, as I think that's even where they had it in the Warcraft movie. So it is an idea that Blizzard liked, but ultimately they just put it in the Blasted Lands, partly because there's nothing else going on there, but I think it's also partly because that's just kind of where it was supposed to be located.
To the iron will of the tyrant Lich King, the vast undead armies of the Scourge seek to eradicate all life on Azeroth.
In lore previously anyway, and they just decided to not move the Dark Portal somewhere else. They also eventually ended up scrapping the battleground in Ajara anyway, and they also converted Tedrasil into the Night Elf starting zone instead of making it into some kind of max level zone or an entrance to the Dark Portal. Alright, and that's it for this little micro fact about WoW. I know I've covered this topic briefly in another video before, but I thought it'd be a good idea to expand upon it a little bit more, as a lot of people just straight up didn't believe me in the other video. Another thing John Stat says in the book is that many players have theories and ideas about why a lot of things happened in World of Warcraft, and like 99% of them were wrong, and a lot of decisions were done on whims or for pretty mundane reasons actually. For some very dedicated wall jumpers and explorers in Vanilla WoW, they were able to discover an early version of Hellfire Peninsula, which was the first zone in the Burning Crusade expansion, which led many people to believe that Blizzard had planned to add Outland to Vanilla WoW instead of it being its own expansion. And there's even some videos online of people exploring the area, and it seems like there's a lot that was done, and a lot of its inspirations were used with the actual Hellfire Peninsula. But according to an interview with a Vanilla WoW developer, that early Hellfire map was most likely just someone playing around with assets, as they never had any plans to add it to Vanilla WoW. And in fact, they didn't even really want to go to Outlands as their first expansion. The first expansion they wanted to have was the South Seas, with pirates and stuff, because the Pirates of the Caribbean movies came out and were super popular at the time. So we could have gotten the BFA expansion, with players going to Kulturas and Zandalar, as the first expansion, rather than like the 7th. And the reason they didn't do that was because of hardware limitations. They literally couldn't add any more maps to the original world map, so they had to create another world tab, which is the main reason why they decided to go with Outlands. That way, they could just put it all in its own world tab, and they could just have players teleport to it when they went to the zones. As if you didn't know, all of Outlands is on the same map as the Blood Elf and Draenei starting zones. If you're able to go out of bounds and go way far into the Fatigue Zone, you could potentially fly into the Blood Elf starting zone, the Ghostlands, or the Draenei starting zone and its extended zone afterwards. Basically, all of the zones added in the Burning Crusade took place on this one world map, because they just didn't have the hardware to put them on their own yet. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this, but apparently this was the best way for them to do it at the time. Eventually, they got server upgrades where this was no longer a big deal, and that's why the next expansion took place in Northrend, which is another map on the Azeroth map, and then they didn't really have the limitations on the Azeroth map after that. So they eventually did the South Seas expansion, which is the current expansion we're in right now, basically. Now, it's a wonder why this never-used version of Hellfire Peninsula snuck its way into the game. But hey, they did have the developer playgrounds in the game files as well, that you could technically get to if you were very creative about using game mechanics or exploiting. So it's not too far-fetched to believe that the Hellfire Peninsula map was also just one of those assets. Although it is kind of hard to believe that they had no plans to add Outland maps, considering they did have plans for the Emerald Dream, which was all popular classes in Classic. Being able to counter all of these CC abilities with a simple offhand is pretty valuable, especially since the damage dealing component is not a debuff but a buff, which means you can just click it off once you've broken free. Now, the reason why it's so low on this list, however, is because if you equip this, it has a 30-second cooldown before it can be used. Meaning it's not really feasible to use mid-combat to escape CC, but rather equipped beforehand, replacing a weapon or another offhand that might have stats on it that would be more useful. But if you have really bad weapons and you're looking for every advantage possible in PvP, then this can definitely help you out in the short term. And at number 9, we have an Alliance-only item called the Bag of Marbles. For anyone who's ever leveled in Elven Forest, you probably had these at one point throughout your adventures, as this comes from a quest called Gold Dust Exchange that starts with Remy 2 times. He tasks you with bringing him 10 gold dust from the kobolds in Fargo Deep Mine and the Jasper Lobe Mine. After slaughtering all the kobolds and collecting all the dust, he rewards you with this item along with some money. Now, the reason why this item is so good is because when used on an enemy, it reduces the target's chance to hit by 25% for 10 seconds, which effectively reduces their damage by 25% on average. However, if you time it, you can use it just before your enemy's powerful abilities, causing their damage to be massively nerfed. This is insanely good at lower levels, as some elite mobs, more specifically Hogger, the Intruder boss of the is nearly impossible to solo for most classes, and having his hit chance reduced to 75% is very, very strong. Not to mention they can be used against players as well. So if you get attacked by a Brogue in Stranglethorn for the 10th time, you can use this against him, and if it lands, it will massively lower his damage. But there's one major downside with this item, as Bag of Marbles can potentially be resisted. And while it doesn't have a level cap per se, the higher level you go, the higher the chance it has to be resisted. But if 1 in 10 chance it doesn't get resisted when used at level 60, then it can be used against a dungeon boss or even a raid boss. And while the likelihood of Bag of Marbles working on raid boss is very, very low, it is still possible, and according to Thoughtbot's comments with WoW, it was used in Dire Maul and even Naxxramas during progression. But since it isn't guaranteed, this is the reason why it lands only the 9th spot on this list. And at number 8, we have actually 2 things, the Crystal Spire and the Crystal Charm. Most of you probably remember that one weird quest in Ungoro Crater where you have to collect all those crystals of varying colors. Well, once you complete that quest, you can continue to pick them up and turn them in for a few different crystals that provide their own specific buffs, depending on what colors you turn in, with these 2 items being the only damaging ones. To get the Crystal Charge, you need 10 red and 10 yellow power crystals, and to get the Crystal Spire, you need 10 blue and 10 yellow power crystals. So, let's start with the Spires first. When consumed, it's basically a Thorn's ability for anyone who uses it, and it causes 12 damage to each attacker when struck. And Crystal Charge acts like a grenade, which is not only an instant throw, but also does quite a good amount of fire damage in a 3-yard radius. Warriors, being amazing tanks as they are in Classic, have trouble keeping aggro with multiple mobs, and having the Crystal Grenade acts as a nice way to get them first AoE aggro, which is not only an overall buff to their damage for AoE, but also lets them hold aggro easier. Along with the Crystal Spire's Pseudo Thorns, this is actually a pretty good, albeit small buff to all tanks, as the constant damage done to them while hitting them will help them hold aggro easier as well. While both of these buffs are great, even if you're not a tank, the reason why this is also lower on this list is because you have to be quite a high level in order to even get them, since the quest starts at level 47. But it is better waited until around level 50 to complete. That and having to farm the crystals over and over again, even though they are plentiful, can get pretty tedious. And at number 7, we have probably the most recognizable consumable in WoW, which is called the Noggin Fogger Elixir.
To get this item, you have to do a small quest chain into Naris from an NPC named Nagenfogger called the Thirsty Goblin, which tasks you with bringing a laden dew gland. Fast forward through some other minor quests in the chain, and you have 5 Nagenfogger as your quest reward, but also an infinite amount of Nagenfogger available and ready to be sold to you. Once you consume it, it gives you one of 3 effects, turning you into a skeleton, decreasing your size, or causing you to float. However, these 3 effects are not just visual, but have bonuses to them. The skeleton transformation makes you able to breathe underwater. The float effect allows you to slow fall, and the shrink effect actually makes your hitbox smaller, making you harder to hit, harder to see, and able to access locations not normally accessible. Now, it is worth mentioning, of course, that Nagenfogger was somewhat spammable, and if you were to get the floating effect to save you at the last moment from a falling death, or spam it in order to get the flow fall effect ahead of time, let's say just jumping from lumbermill to blacksmith, if you were lucky, you could get the floating effect and jump down to blacksmith in time to fight or save the flag. But if you were not, then you would just fall to your death as maybe a skeleton. And the player base at the time dubbed this the Nagenfogger Roulette. The reason why Nagenfogger makes this list at around the middle mark is because it requires the player to beat at least a level 44 to even do. And since the effect was random, it could be rather expensive or annoying to try to get the specific effect that you wanted. Although the quest chain required to unlock the ability to purchase the potion can be quite challenging to some players, but most people use a Nagenfogger for aesthetic purposes instead of its actual utility, because being a skeleton is pretty cool. Like, who can deny that? The potion is unique since each effect can do something pretty useful that gives the drinker a pretty good benefit. And at the 6th spot, we coincidentally have the 6th Demon Bat. This is a trinket that casts one of 6 different spells at random with a 30-year range on a 30-minute cooldown. The 6 spells that this trinket can cast are Fireball, Frostbolt, Chain Lightning, Polymorph, Enveloping Winds, and Summon Fellhound. There's no real confirmed stats on the cast rate of each specific spell, but a few players have estimated it to be around 25% for Fireball, Frostbolt, and Chain Lightning, 10% for Polymorph, and 5% for the last 3. But why is the trinket even good? Well, the spells that it casts scales with the player's spell damage, and 100% of it too, which is really good overall, as not many things scale with 100% of your spell power. The Fireball did around 190 damage, meanwhile the Frostbolt only did 150, but at least it left a 50% slow on the target for 4 seconds. You also had the Chain Lightning, which did around 175 damage to the targets, and with each hit of the ability being boosted by the spell damage, this was pretty powerful for anything over 1 target. The Polymorph spell it cast was just a regular mage polymorph, however only lasting for 20 seconds, and having the chance to backfire on the caster and cause them to be polymorphed instead. Which sounds really bad, but this was actually kind of useful sometimes, as polymorphing gave a huge amount of health regeneration, but would most likely be broken almost immediately since polymorph breaks randomly, or upon receiving any damage. Although the chance of this happening being so random and low meant the situation of it happening when you wanted it or needed it was almost entirely impossible. Next is Enveloping Winds, which looks somewhat like the Druid's Cyclone ability, and stuns the target for 10 seconds, but it's broken upon receiving any damage. And lastly, we have the Fellhound. It behaves very similarly to a normal Warlock pet that's set on attack and will go gung-ho and charge your target. Over its duration, the Fellhound will simply auto-attack its target and also cast its Mana Burn spell on the target if it has mana, which will consume the mana and deal extra damage. Now, each one of these abilities is pretty strong and has their own powerful potential, especially as one of the few bind on equipped trinkets that can be very useful for leveling. But with the negative effects of the long cooldown and not being able to choose which effect you get, leads it to only being the 6th spot on this list. And at number 5, we have all of the Lincoln pieces. Now, these pieces of gear can only be obtained from a very long quest chain in Ungoro Crater that you can find from a destroyed boat in the southeastern part of the map. The quest chain takes the player all across different zones, even requiring them to die at one point to interact with a gravestone. On the final quest, called It's Dangerous to Go Alone, it asks you to kill Blaze Runner, with the completion of the quest offering you the Spirit of Aquamentas, Lincoln's Sword of Mastery, and Lincoln's Boomerang. So let's start with the Spirit of Aquamentas. If you're new or haven't really been looking at other players, this is a very popular offhand for priests and mages to use, as the plus 20 to spell power is really good. You can also choose this or the next item, Lincoln's Sword of Mastery, which is a pretty decent starter tanking sword, since the 1.8 attack speed and the chance to blast the target with nature damage is a nice thing to have for increased threat generation. Both of these are very good for players who want a powerful item to even use in early endgame progression. Whichever one you choose, you also get the Lincoln's Boomerang with it. I have discussed Lincoln's Boomerang in another video before, but I'll go over it again here, as it comes with the other 2 really good items.
The boomerang is a trinket, which flings a magical boomerang that does a small amount of damage and has a chance to stun or disarm the target. A tank being able to use this item at a long range to pull is great, since tanks like paladins wouldn't have to spec into Holy Shock and just use this instead. With the added bonus of stunning or disarming the target being great for PvP too, but the RNG about it was very unreliable. Now, while this spot does have 3 items instead of just 1, the reason for this is because each piece offered by this quest has its own use, with both of the main choices, the offhanded sword, as well as the boomerang, all being useful, and they should all be mentioned all together since you get them at the same time anyway. And at number 4, we have the Barav Peasant Collar. This is a unique trinket that summons 3 random NPCs. At first glance, it doesn't seem like much, but it does a lot more than you'd think. See, the 3 NPCs that are called to do some decent damage, but the damage itself isn't exactly what makes the trinket so good. In vanilla, spellcasters have to deal with spell pushback quite often, which is when the cast bar recoils a bit whenever you're hit. And having something like a hunter pet stuck on a priest that's casting can make it so the priest has such an effect that they cast 30% slower depending on the attack speed of the pet. So, if a single hunter pet is that strong at slowing a caster, imagine 3 NPCs all in melee fighting at the exact same time. The spell pushback is so strong that it's almost impossible for a spellcaster to cast at all before just being killed by another player. Not only this, but the servants themselves have quite a bit of health and cannot be killed by just a simple quick AoE spell, as the only real way to stop them from attacking you is if you were a mage and just use Ice Nova, for example, to escape. But all other casters have no real way to deal with them easily, and will just be completely curb stomped into the ground. On top of this trinket can be used while stunned, and is an excellent way to prevent a rogue from getting a re-stealth due to all the mobs hitting, forcing them to either run away or use Vanish, which won't even help, as for a long time, these mobs were bugged and would continue to attack a rogue even who had vanished. This trinket can also be used from range and is a great way to eat a hunter trap for you, or 2 or even 3, as they could soak a freezing trap for each, for example. Now, to get this trinket, you must complete the Barov family fortune quest in the Western Plaguelands. That varies depending on what faction you're on, while the Alliance turned it into Weldon Barov and Horde turned it into Alexei Barov to get it. You then have to go into Skolomance and recover all the Barov family deeds, which is one for Brill, Cardaro, South Shore, and Terran Mill. And once you bring it back, you're tasked with killing the opposite faction's quest giver. Now that this is completed, you now have the Barov Peasant Collar. And with Skolomance being a very popular dungeon, you're likely to do this anyway, but the very high level requirement and needing a group to even complete it can definitely prolong this trinket's obtainability until later on. But it's still a very strong PvP and PvE trinket. And at number 3, we have a Horde exclusive item called Really Sticky Glue. This is a quest reward from the Solvent Spirit, which is available from Master Varnal by the Troll starting area. This quest tasks you with bringing 4 intact Mercure eyes and 8 vials of crawler mucus back to him, and in return, he gives you 10 really sticky glue. Now, this item being offered at such a low level is insane. See, the glue that it uses is a player version of Spider's Web, and like the Bag of Marbles, can be used against players and elites, although the higher the level, the higher the chance it can be resisted or breaking out upon taking damage. So not only does this have insane use for PvP by allowing you to CC kiting classes like mages or hunters, or CC power classes like warrior, or for example paladin, making them waste Blessing of Freedom just to dispel the effect, which can very easily turn the tide in your favor since they won't have it up for later. Or just have them sit there and stare at you, like warriors are great at doing. Not only that, but being usable by a class that doesn't even have a root in their ability list, like a warlock or priest for example, can very easily make them overpowered. Now, we do have an item like it available to engineers, which a lot of people are, but not everyone. The Gnomish Netomatic Projector, a trinket that has unlimited use and a much higher hit chance. However, this uses up a trinket slot, which has a chance to backfire, requiring a high-level Gnomish engineering and 10 times longer the cooldown, while also taking up a full trinket slot which could have gone to an insignia instead, or any other damage/utility ones, is quite a big trade-off since trinkets have quite a lot of value in vanilla for PvP. Now, the bad part is that since patch 1.7, when they made this item bind on pickup, you can't farm this item on a bunch of low levels and then send it to your main character and just have an infinite supply like you could in early vanilla. Which admittedly does suck, but it's kinda needed because being able to have a ton of these would make PvP an even more unbalanced mess. But an item available from a low level class that was as good, if not better than an item crafted with a near max level profession, shows just how strong it is. And at number 2, we have the Rune of the Guard Captain. This is a Horde exclusive trinket that's the best in slot PvP trinket for not only Fury Warriors, but for Enhancement Shamans, Feral Druids, Rogues, and also Protection Warriors during Phase 2. The reason for this is because the increase to hit stat on a trinket is very rare, as the only other hit stat trinkets in vanilla are the Kiss of the Spider, which drops from Iaxna and Naxxramas, and the Dark Fane Talisman, which drops from Ebonrock and Blackwing Lair. Well, unless you're a rogue, as they have the Dire Maul Royal Seal trinket that comes with 2% hit, making it BIS for a long time. Since the two non-rogue trinkets are both max level raid items, Rune of the Guard Captain can be obtained as early as level 46, making it an amazing trinket to get. See, in order to never miss a level 60 target with auto attacks, you need a bare minimum of 5% hit, while dual wielding players need 24%. For level cap bosses, which are level 63, you need 9% chance to hit and 25% chance for dual wielding. Now, while there are obviously other hit increasing items in literally every other slot, those are fairly common to come by, while one slot, trinkets, are not, and having a required stat on something that's already pretty good can be obtained somewhat early and doesn't have an upgrade until way later on. This made it one of the best pre-level cap trinkets in the game during that phase. However, this trinket is Horde only, giving Horde, who keep in mind have insane racials, even more power in PvP, while Alliance having nothing equivalent to it, making this trinket very, very important for not only PvPers but also PvEers who are still trying to get their other trinkets. And at the number 1 spot, we have Magic Dust. This is an item with a small drop chance from Unbound Cyclones in Westfall, and what this item does is put an enemy to sleep for 30 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown, and can be used on both NPCs and players. Now, just by hearing this, you probably already know the serious value behind the item, as some classes, like Warriors, have trouble dealing with multiple mobs at one time, especially while leveling, and being able to put an enemy to sleep on an instant cast for 30 seconds at such a low level can be a lifesaver. But I know what you're thinking. Does it make another player sleep for 30 seconds in PvP? Well, yeah, kinda. Like the glue, each second with the effect, NPCs and even more so players will have a chance to break free of the effect. And it even goes through a Paladin's Blessing of Protection as it's classified as shadow magic. This means that only an undead Will of the Forsaken and a Shaman's Tremor Totem will be able to break it, as regular trinkets don't remove sleep effects yet. So if you decide to twink, as was pretty common for vanilla, or if you were just a low-level character, let's say a rogue having double blind along with regular CC effects, you get the idea. Also, this is very useful for hunters too, outside of the regular effect it gives. For their epic bow quest to get Rock Delar, you can use this dust on Simon's pet to CC it while you fight the demon, since traps can't be used in combat. If you were smart enough, you could lay a trap beforehand, fight Simone, and then when the trap ends, you can just tap target, use the dust on the pet, and keep fighting Simone normally, making her pet useless the entire time. And these were also a great gold maker too, and would sell for quite a lot since the mobs that dropped them were farmable by both Horde and Alliance. So unlike the bag of marbles or really sticky glue, you can have an infinite supply of these, assuming you had the gold to buy them or the time to spend farming them.
In this video, we'll go over 10 talents from Vanilla WoW that are a little weird, in the way that they're either really bad, out of place, or just did a unique thing. But mostly, a lot of these are just going to be kind of bad. And starting off, we'll go with one of those out of place talents. So number 10 will be Weapon Balance. Now, I'm going to read you what this talent does, and I want you to guess which class and spec it belongs to. Increases the damage you deal with melee weapons by 2%, up to a maximum of 10% with 5 talent points. Now, would you think this was a talent for a weapon-based class, like a warrior, rogue, or paladin? Well, you'd be wrong, because this was a deep talent in the Balance Druid tree. Weapon Balance was a 20-point talent for Balance Druids, a spec that today could be more accurately described as a pure caster class. In Vanilla WoW, or in the early days of Vanilla WoW anyway, Balance Druids didn't really have a niche yet, and their talents generally increased the damage or interacted with their spell casting, with the final talent in the tree being Hurricane, a spell casting AoE. And then randomly there was Weapon Balance, which increased the damage they did with their melee weapons, despite the fact that they had no melee attacks with weapons, nor any other talents in the balance tree that indicated they wanted to use melee weapons. Now, druids did have melee abilities while in cat or bear form, and this talent did not affect those. Eventually though, in a later patch, weapon balance was removed from druids, and they kind of redid the talent tree a little bit to be more spellcasting focused, and even gave them Moonkin form as their final talent. And at number 9, we have Curse of Exhaustion. Curse of Exhaustion in its first form was kind of a unique slow. Curse of Exhaustion was a 20-point talent in the Affliction tree, and it gave the Warlock a curse with the effect of reduce the target speed to 90% of their normal run speed for 12 seconds. Now, what's interesting about this is that it doesn't just say lower your target speed by 10%. It says reduce their speed to 90% of normal. And this little distinction actually makes it so it's a little bit more useful than the standard slow. Now, there was also another talent right next to this one, which would increase the slow to 30%, which most people took with this talent, so I'm just going to refer to it as a 30% slow for the rest of this part. Anyways, with its unique wording, if you applied Curse of Exhaustion to a player on a mount, for example, it would first reduce the running speed to the standard 100%, so completely ignoring the mount movement speed increase, and then it would apply the 30% slow. Whereas other movement speed decreases would just slow on top of the mounted speed, and not slow for as much as Curse of Exhaustion. Or if used on any other run speed increase, like a sprint, for example, it would lower their run speed to 100%, and then lower that by another 30%. It would just normalize the run speed, and then slow them, which made it a pretty decent slow. And then in a later patch in vanilla, Blizzard removed this distinction and just turned Curse of Exhaustion into a normal slow, with its new effect being reduces the target movement speed by 30% for 12 seconds. So the reason this one even makes this list wasn't because it was bad, but because its effect was unique. And at number 8, we have Throwing Weapon Specialization. This was a 25-point combat rogue talent with 2 ranks that would increase the range of your thrown weapons by 6 yards. Now, here's the thing about thrown weapons in vanilla WoW. They sucked. Thrown weapons did terrible damage, required you to aim the weapon, or I guess had a casting time, and had a cooldown. You could only use the throwing weapon once, or maybe twice, if you had a fast one and did a little bit of kiting, but it was so inefficient to use throwing weapons that they were really only ever used to just pull a mob. And that's about it. You did not need to throw extra ones, nor did you need to waste talent points deep in the combat tree to get an extra 6 yards on it. Basically, what I'm trying to say is this talent was useless, but not only that, it was a top talent, being only second to the final talent in the combat tree, Adrenaline Rush. That's why in patch 1.12, Throwing Weapon Specialization was removed from the combat tree, and instead it was replaced with Weapon Expertise, which was much better, as it gave the rogue 6 extra expertise in swords, fists, and dagger weapons. Number 7. Two-handed axes and maces. This was a 10-point enhancement shaman talent that allowed the shaman to use two-handed axes and maces. Pretty simple effect. Enhanced shamans also had a 20-point talent called parry, which allowed them to parry attacks. Here's the thing about these two talents. All other classes that can parry or use two-handed weapons get those abilities as baseline abilities, not something you have to talent into. And after vanilla WoW, no classes had to use talent points to be able to use two-handed weapons or parry. But during vanilla WoW, enhanced shamans had this unique distinction of needing to waste their talent points to get baseline stuff. But what made two-handed axes and maces kind of annoying, for lack of a better word, was the fact that if you swapped your talents and lost this talent point, you lost all of your skills in those weapons. So if you took this talent again later on, you'd have to skill up your two-handed axes and mace skill from 0. Vanilla WoW did not have dual talent specialization. That was not added until Wrath of the Lich King, so every time an enhanced shaman had to swap specs, they would have to spend a couple hours skilling up their skills in these two weapons, something no other class needed to do, because they were given their abilities to use weapons as baseline abilities, not talents. Number 6. The Lightwell. Lightwell is infamous for being one of the worst and poorly designed abilities in WoW's history, despite the fact that it seems like a pretty useful ability at first glance. Lightwell was a last point talent in the Holy Tree for priests, and had the effect of creates a holy light well near the priest, and party and raid members can click on the light well to restore health over 10 seconds. Being attacked cancels this effect. At first glance, it seems pretty useful. The priest will place down a light well, and party members can click on it to heal themselves. But here's the thing. For the longest time, taking damage would cancel the heal you got from the light well. I think this was in place so that a healer couldn't just drop a light well next to a tank, and they could just keep clicking on it to heal themselves while tanking. But this also made it kind of awkward to use for other people, as in a raid fight, you'd constantly be taking damage, which could easily cancel this effect. And there's also the thing that players have to click on it themselves if they want to get a heal. And it was easy for players to accidentally click it multiple times and use up too many of the charges at once. And there's also the thing that no one ever wanted to click on the light well. In fact, it was kind of infamous for this, and probably this reason alone. Blizzard even put it on some of their loading screen tips for people to just click on the light well. Blizzard tried so hard to get people to click on the light well that they eventually gave up and converted into something that would spit out heals to people, before finally removing the ability with Legion. And at number 5, we've got Lacerate, the last talent in the Survival Hunter tree. Lacerate is a pretty standard dot. It was a melee range bleed that did about 100 damage over 21 seconds, and did not scale. Serpent Sting at rank 4, which hunters obtained at level 40, did 140 damage over 15 seconds, which is just a straight up better dot. And Serpent Sting is baseline, and a ranged ability. The max rank of Serpent Sting obviously did much more damage. Lacerate was just really bad for some reason. But also in the survival tree, there was an ability called Melee Specialization, which increased the damage a hunter did with melee weapons by 5%, and was at the 25-point talent mark, the second to last row before Lacerate in the survival tree. Hunters in Vanilla WoW had terrible melee damage, but Blizzard had a couple of abilities in the survival tree sorted towards melee. In patch 1.7, Lacerate was removed from the survival tree and replaced with Wyvern String. And then after that, they didn't completely remove melee talents from the survival tree until Mists of Pandaria. Number 4, Blood Craze. Blood Craze is a 10-point Fury Warrior talent with the effect of regenerate 3% of your total health over 6 seconds after being the victim of a critical strike. Now at first glance, this may seem like a pretty niche heal, until you remember a few things about combat in Vanilla WoW. For one, its heal is really low, 3% of your total health over 6 seconds, as if getting 3% of your health instantly would be too much or something. But putting it as a 6-second hot, well, it's kind of like a worse version of Brush It Off. Brush It Off is the new Colteran human racial, which heals you for 2% of the damage you take over 4 seconds. Except Brush It Off works on any ability, and not just crits. Which brings me to another part of this ability. It only activates if you're subject to a critical strike. One of the tank's jobs is getting enough defense rating so that they won't be crit by bosses, who have an inherent 6% chance to crit. So Blood Craze isn't a tanking talent. Fury Warriors and raids should not be getting hit by anything. So it's not a PvE raid or dungeon talent. Out in the open world though, spells can't crit you, but physical, ranged, and melee attacks can. And if they do so much damage that this tiny little heal isn't going to help very much, especially having to spend 3 points into it. But what's funny about this talent is that this is the buffed version of Blood Craze. The original version of Blood Craze had this effect. Allows 15% of your health regeneration to work during combat for 20 seconds after being the victim of a critical strike. And health regeneration as a stat in Vanilla WoW is just referring to your out of combat health regeneration. You know, the thing that recovered incredibly slowly in Vanilla WoW? Health regeneration was so bad that the troll racial regeneration, which allowed 10% of your health regeneration to continue during combat at all times, was considered one of the worst racials in the game. And the original talent allowed you to sometimes have a slightly better version than the troll racial, only after being hit by a crit, of course. That is to say, Blood Craze was a very interesting talent, and for some reason was very rarely picked, despite warriors having almost no self-healing in vanilla. Number 3, Divine Strength. Let's play another little guessing game. I'm going to read off what this talent does, and then I want you to guess which paladin tree it's a deep talent in. Divine Strength increases your strength by 10% at 5 ranks. If you guessed it was a 25-point holy talent, and in the second to last row, you'd be correct. But did you also know holy paladins didn't do melee damage? Or they weren't supposed to anyway, in raids or PvP where it mattered. This is just another one of those interesting talents that would actually be really good for a lot of classes, but for some reason is given to a spec that doesn't need it, and that's why it was later removed from the holy tree. I should also mention that the last talent at the time was Holy Shock, which is a spell holy paladins have today, except in its first version, it only did damage, had a 20-yard range, and a 30-second cooldown. Holy Shock was supposed to be the paladin version of the Shaman Shocks, except all 3 of the Shaman Shocks were really good, and had 6-second cooldowns. And for some reason they gave paladins 1 shock with a much longer cooldown at 30 seconds, but with the same short 20-yard range, and not at all good. Later on in vanilla though, they did finally give it the option to heal instead of doing damage, which was the hallmark of the Holy Shock ability, where you could choose to do either or, but it still wasn't good. Blizzard had a really hard time getting paladins to use Holy Shock, basically until they added Holy Power to the game in Cataclysm. Number 2, Primal Instincts. This was the final talent in the Feral Druid tree, which had the effect of lowering the mana cost of your shapeshifting by 25%. Now, shapeshifting was very mana intensive, and Blizzard did intend for druids to be able to change forms regularly during combat, but shapeshifting was too mana expensive, and a 25% reduction was not enough to encourage shapeshifting combat. And in fact, a 25% mana reduction to shapeshifting was a terrible final talent, and that's why they removed it and replaced it with something better, and then moved this talent to the balance tree in the second row of talents and renamed it to Natural Shapeshifter, which at 3 ranks reduced the mana cost of shapeshifting by 30%, and at an easy point to get in the talent tree, with only requiring 3 ranks, wasn't half bad here. And that's the thing, this version of it was just straight up better than Primal Instincts, and even then, it's a pretty meh talent. Which should go to show how terrible Primal Instincts was. It was a worse version of Natural Shapeshifter, and one of the final talents the Feral Druid could take, a role usually taken up by one of their best abilities or talents. And finally, number 1, Master Conjurer. This was a 15-point demonology talent that, at max rank, reduced the mana cost and casting time of your stone creations by 40%. Here's the thing about Warlock stones. They could only create 4 of them. 2 of them were basically useless, and the 2 useful ones, the Health Stone and Soul Stone, were never casted in combat. All 4 of them were things you casted outside of combat as kind of a preparation spell. So their cast times and mana costs didn't matter, which in lies this talent's uselessness. At least Primal Instincts was somewhat useful, as shapeshifting was very mana expensive, and something you might have to do in combat sometimes. Although rarely did you have to cast any of your stone abilities in combat. In a later patch of Vanilla WoW, Blizzard just straight up removed this talent, as no one really took it and it was kind of useless. And I think that's why I put it at number 1. Out of all the talents, this one is arguably the least useful one, which is saying something considering a lot of the talents I covered in this video. Back in